Welcome, everybody. My honey people are here. Thank you for coming. So the World Atlas of Honey is really, it's a celebration of honey around the world. And one of the most underappreciated characteristics of honey is the diversity. And when I say diversity, I mean the colors, the flavors, the smells, the taste, the textures. And of course, we don't really see this every day because most of us are buying our honey from the grocery store. And the honey that's sold is mostly imported. It's always medium amber in color. The flavor is flavorless and the texture is always liquid. So we have a honey tasting later and you're going to see the diversity of the colors, the smells, the flavors, the taste. And this is really a celebration of seeking out these kinds of honeys, meeting beekeepers, and the stories that they tell of how they actually harvest the honey. The really interesting thing about honey is that when bees gather the nectar from various botanical sources, those flowers are what impart the different flavors of honey. So when we talk about flavor, we're talking about things like cinnamon and aromatics and, rosemary notes or caramelly notes, woody notes, animal kind of funky notes. And there's a real world in the book about how to taste and evaluate honey. So people ask me, how did I get into honey? This is my fourth book about bees and mostly honey. And when I first became a beekeeper, accidentally, like Sarah said, most of us come to beekeeping by chance. I came from the arts and I lived in Connecticut and I went to art school in New York. When I came back to Connecticut as an adult, I didn't really know anybody. And I met one of my neighbors who happened to be a beekeeper, and they invited me over to their house to meet their bees. And mind you, this is back in like 2000. And before we had farmers markets, really, before we were talking about organic and natural and local and all of that stuff. So to meet a beekeeper was a little bit offbeat. And I took a chance and I went over to their house and we smoked the hive. We opened up the lid. And the first thing that struck me was that the bees were calm and docile, because I had grown up thinking, oh, bees are going to attack, watch out, they're dangerous. But in fact, they're very docile creatures. So he explained everything that was going on in the hive. And that visit ended with me getting to taste the fresh honey out of the hive. And it was the most delicious, fresh, flavorful thing that I had ever had. So some people are smiling, beekeepers. So that experience, because like most people, I grew up with a little plastic teddy bear in the grocery store, and it's been heated and imported and everything else. And when it crystallizes, we just threw it away. But this experience really took me back, and I took up beekeeping really as a hobby, something to do on the weekends. I didn't really think anything of it. So I joined my local bee club and I met other beekeepers and we started trading honey. And when people would go on trips, they would bring me honey from different places and I would pick up honey, different stores, wherever. And at one point in my house, I had a shelf probably of 75 different honeys from all over. And beautiful labels, different countries, different colors. And every day I would look at them and I would admire them, but I had no way to appreciate them or taste them or talk about them or even tell my fellow beekeepers what I had. I would just say, oh, I have this honey from Slovenia. I have this honey from Africa. I had no words to talk about it or even like appreciate it. So I was on the hunt and I was searching everything I could find about honey. I was reading as much as I could. I was talking to beekeepers that were so much more experienced than I was and asking them, so as a beekeeper, is there a database that I can look at that can tell me if my bees are visiting clover, that my honey should be grassy and it should have a little bit of a spicy note to it, or if my bees are visiting orange blossoms, what would my honey taste like? Is there a database? And everybody looked at me and said, no, we don't have a database. But the worst part of it is they didn't care. And I was thinking, okay, I'm crazy. I have all these beautiful honeys and I don't know how to taste them. So I thought, I'm a little bit of a foodie, and I thought, let me start tasting wine. There's a lot of professional wine tasters. Why don't I learn how to taste wine and then I'll switch it over to honey? So that was my thinking. And I actually took a job as a wine salesperson, which is terrible because I'm not a salesperson, but I wanted to learn. I am about to, I wanted to learn the tasting technique, which I learned over 6 weeks, but then when it was time to sell wine, I was a failure. But I got the knowledge of how to taste, and I thought, let me switch this over to honey. So slowly I started doing that, and I was still on the hunt. So I ended up in Italy on a vacation and stumbled upon a honey festival. So it was basically, like an outdoor fair with beekeepers selling their honeys. And I noticed all the honey had the botanical source on it. Like every jar said either chestnut honey or lime honey or clover honey or, eucalyptus honey. And I was saying, well, how do you know that? And they're like, well, we know. And I'm like, okay. So I was walking around this beautiful ancient ruins, and I go to one corner and there was some people there with honey lined up in wine glasses the way we have here, all by color. It was a rainbow, and my eyes literally popped out of my head. And I was like, the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The colors like a rainbow lined up. You don't see that in the store. You don't see that ever. And I asked them what they were doing, and they said, well, we're having a honey tasting, come back. And I was like, well, I am gonna wait. I'm not going anywhere to miss this. So what happened was the people took the wine glasses and they would pass them around and let us taste the honey. And they would tell us the botanical source, and then they would tell us what the honey color should be, what the smell should be, and what the flavor should be, and where it was produced in the country of Italy. And I thought, wow, they're talking about honey like as if it's wine. And I wanted to learn this. So they went through like 18 honeys, and like everybody's tasting them and asking questions. So afterwards, I started talking to them and asking about this knowledge. Like, how did you know that? And they said, well, we have honey school. And I thought, honey school, when is that take place? I want to go to honey school. So in the typical Italian style, honey school was online in Italian, very disorganized, no real dates, no real towns, like no easy, like click and register and get there. So my Italian was okay, and I was just, searching. So when I got back to the States, I started posting pictures of this experience in Montalcino and all the honeys and talking about honey tasting. And I get a message from somebody in Italy that said, why don't you come to honey school? And I was like, oh my gosh, finally. So he had the dates and everything of when the class was. So I had about 6 months to prepare to get on a plane. And it was on the island of Sardinia, which is this little island under Corsica. So I get on a plane and I go to Sardinia, and I make it past all the goats on the road and, lost in the mountains. And I end up at the facility where the class was. And there was the guy who was the teacher who had emailed me. So I end up for 4 days in the class. And basically, it was everything that I was hoping it would be. It was basically tasting, smelling, writing notes, learning how to describe all of the smells and the flavors of honey. It was also about crystallization, which everybody knows that honey, well, everybody doesn't know, but you may have seen how honey gets thick and hard and we think like it's old. So we learned about crystallization structures. We learned about defects in honey, which are different kinds of smells and flavors that don't necessarily belong there, that end up in the honey because maybe the beekeepers' management or harvesting practices were not clean and just to let you know when I talk about a defect in a honey. For example, one would be the beekeeper is smoking the hive to do an inspection and they use too much smoke, and that smoke gets into the wax and into the honey, and you taste it. And it's not really supposed to be a smoky honey, but it was the beekeeper. So there are a few different kinds of things that go wrong if you're not careful with managing and harvesting your honey. So the class after 4 days was everything that I had ever wanted. And at the end of the 4 days, there's a test. Well, there's tests all throughout, but there's like a quiz where you have to memorize 18 different honeys and identify them by smell and taste alone. Now, doesn't this sound like a wine class? If you were going to become a wine expert, like this is what wine people do. They taste it and they tell you what grape it is and where it comes from. So Italy has for 40 years spearheaded this kind of method, they call it, of evaluating honey through smell and flavor. Excuse me. So I was very excited about that. And I decided that I needed to go back and finish the level 2 and the level 3 of the course and do all the testing. And it took me about 2 years, and they kept saying, why are you coming back? And I was like, I want to learn about honey. And they're like, well, don't you have honey school in the US? And I was like, no, we don't. And so when I came back, I passed the test. And you can make an application to become a member of their organization, which allows you to be a honey judge in Italy. So you have to be trained to be a judge. So I was accepted to the National Register as the first American person to do this, partly because everything has been done in Italian language and they've been hiding this information. So nobody, if you don't speak or read Italian, you would never know about it. But when I came back from the US to the US, I was, writing articles for the bee magazines, and I was telling people about this. And I would say, oh, I'm a honey expert. I went to honey school. And they would say, oh, that's great. You learned about beekeeping? And I would say, no, I learned about honey. And they would say, well, what do you mean honey? I said, well, I studied honey. And they would look like cross-eyed at me. And the only way that I can really explain it to them was, if you think about going to school to become a wine expert or a wine sommelier, everything that you would learn, the grapes, the regions, the flavors, the taste, where it was produced, how it was produced, take all of that and put it to honey. And again, like most people, we don't think of honey as being diverse and having all of these flavors and, traveling the world and visiting beekeepers and checking out their kinds of unique honeys that they have and the different bees in the regions. So that's been basically where my background came from. I guess just I'm a very curious person. So I fell into the beekeeping rabbit hole, and then I fell into the honey rabbit hole. So little by little, I've been teaching and doing a lot of classes and online, and getting more beekeepers to go to Italy or to come to me to do this training, because now I'm an official teacher for the national, it's called the National Register of Honey Experts. So slowly I'm getting more beekeepers trained to learn more about honey, and then they can pass it on to their customers and help market their honey, because we know that most of the honey sold in the stores is cheap imported honey, and there's very little oversight. And the consumers don't really know what they're getting. And when you buy a jar of honey, it's usually the only jar of honey you have in your house. So if you buy 2 jars of honey, you have something to, taste against, but who does that? Some of us do, but most people don't. So they don't really have any way to really look at honey in that way, in a way where they would, recognize different flavors. So as you taste these honeys, you're going to see how the colors are just so diverse. And then as you taste them, you're going to be experiencing like different kinds of smells and flavors of the honeys. And some of them are from the US, some of them, Sarah brought some from local. And then I have a couple that are from different countries and different regions. And most people just don't realize how diverse honey is and the characteristics. And I think that once you do taste these honeys, and if you've had real honey before, you won't go back to the store-bought honey. And that's really the goal here, is to, support beekeepers who are doing the good hard work and, preserving their diversity and their bees, and to help them to, market their honey and against, the cheap imports that are out there. So also in the book is in two parts. The first part has some talk about culinary aspects of honey, some history, some magical properties of it. I know everybody's really interested in the medicinal properties of honey. And honey has a very unique chemical composition, which makes it very unique in all kinds of foods, meaning that the chemical composition is what gives it these very distinctive antibacterial properties. Basically, I could tell you quickly that honey is a very acidic substance. On the pH scale, it's very low. So the acidity does not allow bacteria, certain kinds of bacteria and foreign pathogens to grow or survive in honey. So right there is a great health benefit. The other thing is that what's interesting is that honey is hygroscopic, meaning that it absorbs moisture and it also absorbs smell in the air because of the water content to the sugar content. So it's a lot of sugar dissolved in a little bit of water. So it's always trying to grab moisture to meet equilibrium. So honey's about 20% water, 80% sugars, and equilibrium would be about 36. So it's always trying to get to that 36% moisture. And when it does this, if you use honey topically on wounds, it will steal the moisture from bacteria that it needs to survive. So bacteria will get starved by honey by putting it on wounds, like for wound care, cuts, burns, and all of that. And the third thing is that bees add an enzyme called glucose oxidase. They add a lot of different enzymes, but they add this one enzyme that will transform the glucose in the honey into hydrogen peroxide, just a little bit over a short period of time. And this is also another reason that honey has these antibacterial properties, which is magic because no other food has this chemical composition and these amazing properties. And then I have some information about the history of honey, how honey was used in warfare. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. I don't want to ruin it, but also mad honey, which is a honey that is produced from a certain kind of rhododendron and some other different plants that have granulotoxins, which is like a neurotoxin in the nectar. So if you consume large amounts of that honey, you can become hallucinogenic and ill. It's primarily from Turkey. So there's a lot of stories and mystery and traditions and culture of how honey fits into the world in various countries. And these are stories that, have to be told. And I'm telling them in different ways throughout the book that you can really sort of fall in love with honey the way I have. So how are we doing on time?
About 8 more minutes.
8 more minutes? Oh, okay. Well, we can talk about honey for 8 more hours. But so there's a lot of information, and the book is kind of set up in a way that you don't have to read it cover to cover. You can just drop in for a few minutes or drop in for a few hours and get a lot of really good information about honey. And like I said, these are stories that we don't really know these stories. We don't see them because we're looking at this commercial honey in the grocery store that is this homogenized product that's just devoid of any kind of benefits or flavor. So I guess we can open to questions. If anyone has any questions, beekeepers.
So I have bees on my property, but I am not the beekeeper, a neighbor is. And another neighbor had a patch of buckwheat. And his honey was like almost black. And it was
Okay.
really very, very pungent and just, it was delicious. And he swore that it was a cure for colds. Is there any, do you have any knowledge of that? Or, I mean, if for some reason it was supposed to be great for,
So, yeah,
Yeah.
where is that, in Connecticut?
yeah.
So, yeah, buckwheat honey is very, very dark. It can be very bitter. Honey doesn't cure anything. It relieves symptoms.
Okay.
So we can all agree, I think most of us, is that, if you have a sore throat, you don't feel good, you have maybe seasonal allergies, a spoonful of honey is very soothing if you put it in tea or if you just have it directly. It's almost like, being hugged by a cashmere blanket. It's just so comforting. There is not a lot of knowledge about allergies, but people will always tell me that honey helps their allergies, it helps their kids' allergies. And, those chemical composition and those benefits, those are real antibacterial. So I guess they would turn over. I'm not a doctor, but I do use honey when I don't feel good, if I have allergies. The darker honeys have more minerals in them. And I know in Poland and a lot of Eastern European countries, buckwheat honey is their cure-all. They turn to their local buckwheat honey for colds and any kind of ailments. But basically, it definitely relieves symptoms, but I wouldn't say it would cure anything. Propolis might cure. Propolis is something that the bees make. It's a sticky substance that's made from the sap of the trees. And if you don't know what propolis is, you Google it, but you can also get it in health food store. It's always in the section where the throat lozenges and the throat sprays are. Magic. That cures a sore throat. Propolis.
What do you do about crystallizing?
Great question. So crystallization is actually a sign of quality, but it depends upon the crystal structure. So when you see honey that's crystallized, it should crystallize evenly throughout. It should be all the same texture, like peanut butter, for example. You can even hold that up. The wine glass, yeah.
Oh.
So you want to look for a crystal structure that's even throughout. You don't want to see liquid on the top, crystals on the bottom, big crystals, little crystals. You really don't want that. You want like a nice even texture. And what do you do about it? You spread it on toast. Or you take a big spoonful and you put it in your tea and stir it until it melts. You can melt it if you want, like re-liquefy it, but you want to be very careful because heating honey is going to change the color. It'll get darker, but it'll also, compromise some of the health benefits. So if you want to liquefy it for cooking, like you need a cup of honey, what I would suggest is take the jar, put it in some hot water and let it sit and stir it or shake it so that it melts evenly. And when I have to do that, which I don't do a lot, what I do is I don't melt it all the way down so that it's pure liquid. I just have a little bit of heat, get it so it moves. And then if you want to add it to your recipe, just so it moves, because it has to mix evenly. But I wouldn't blast it. But again, so when you see crystallized honey in the store, like in those plastic containers, you're gonna see there's liquid at the top and there's like a fuzzy cotton thing going on. It's just all odd. It shouldn't be like that. That honey is either very old or it's been heated at very high temperatures. So you want to look for like that evenness throughout.
So when crystallized in my home, what causes that to happen?
What causes honey to crystallize? So basically honey is 20% water and 80% sugars. It's fructose and glucose. So when the glucose ratio is higher than the fructose, it will crystallize quicker. And the reason is the glucose is less soluble in water than fructose. Little sciencey, but some honeys have higher fructose contents. The ratio is higher than the glucose and it will crystallize much slower. Like some honeys stay liquid for a very long time. And it's because they have a higher fructose content than glucose.
So is that where the bees get the flowers that they go to? Does that determine?
It's just-
fructose, glucose?
It's just the nature of that particular nectar from that particular flower. But also there's other things that other variables like temperature. If you store honey like at a cooler temperature below 55, it could accelerate crystallization. If the moisture content happens to be higher, it may not crystallize as quickly. So there's a lot of different variables, but basically it's the glucose fructose ratio that determines how and why and if the honey will crystallize.
Thank you.
A lot of science.
I had some surgery on my foot and I got the bandage wet. And it wasn't supposed to. And so when they went to look at the stitches, they said, oh, well, you've got some water under there. And they said you should use Manuka honey.
Yeah,
And that will dry out that. But when I looked up Manuka honey, it's not really from a bee, it's a tree.
Manuka is a tree and the bees make honey from it. It's in the book.
Oh,
So yeah, you have to dry that out because the moisture is gonna feed the bacteria and your infection could get worse. So you wanna dry it out, and Manuka honey is a honey that's produced only in New Zealand. They say it's in Australia too, but true Manuka comes from New Zealand, from the Leptosporum tree, which is a tea tree tea tree tea, say that fast. So it's a very special honey that has very special antibacterial, they call it activity. And they sell it in the stores and they're graded by numbers. And the higher the number, the higher the activity is or the benefits are. Some of them, some of the honey can be up to $100 or $200, depending upon the quality, the freshness of it. So Manuka has these very special healing properties. They say that it can heal MRSA, which is like a bacteria, MRSA, and open wounds. It's really good for. It's actually great for digestion, internal ulcers, digestion. But the key is that you really need to know your source. So like everything else, like honey is the third most adulterated food on the market on a global scale after milk and olive oil. So there's a lot of honey sold as Manuka.
Oh,
So you really have to know your source and you do have to spend a little bit of money to get a good quality one.
But do bees make?
Yeah, so bees visit this Manuka tree, they gather that nectar and they bring it back to the hive and they have their own enzymes and they make it into honey. But it's the particular tree and it's the particular region. So the soil, the rainforest, atmosphere, the sun, the moisture and all of that. It has to be produced in New Zealand. Manuka's not in Connecticut, Manuka's not in Canada. It has to be from that region.
Is it that it won't grow here or it's?
It could grow here, I guess, but you need, since a bee goes 4 miles from the hive, you need to have acres and acres of Manuka. And not only it's the tree, it's the soil, it's the environment, it's the rainforest. Manuka honey tastes like a rainforest. It tastes like this dried leaves, moisture. It tastes like where it's from. The best way that I can explain it to you is if you've ever bought champagne, it can only be called champagne if it's made in the Champagne region of France. Otherwise, it's sparkling wine. Manuka has to be made in New Zealand or it should not be called Manuka. It's not true Manuka. Like Chianti wine has to be made in Chianti, Italy. So, Gorgonzola has to be from Gorgonzola, Parma has to be from Parma. So in order for it to be true Manuka, it has to come from that specific place.
So do you think the things that are sold, like when you go, are really Manuka honey, or they can just label it Manuka?
There's very little oversight
Wow.
on things. I can tell you, I don't like to name names, but there's a company called Bees and Trees that you might find in Whole Foods. They're very good Manuka.
Okay,
Expensive, but you're getting liquid gold, you're getting medicine.
okay.
And you're not gonna eat the whole thing. Manuka is something that you would use as needed. Because it's more of a medicine, it's not like, and I wouldn't put my Manuka in a cup of tea. I would be like, I need medicine, I have a stomach problem, I have an irritable bowel, I need some Manuka.
Mm.
I would put it on toast maybe, but Manuka for me is like as needed. It's not my everyday honey, because I wanna save it for like when I need it, right?
So you said bees travel, so how do, like, you know what you're being eating to know, like, what your food gonna taste like? Or do you
That's a
just
great
give it
question.
from tasting it, don't
So certain areas, there are acres and acres of one flower, so that when the bees are gathering nectar, it's primarily from one flower. So for example, if you wanted blueberry blossom honey, you would go to Maine, or you would go to Michigan where there's acres and acres of blueberry farms. If you wanted orange honey, you would go to maybe Florida where the orange groves are. You could try to plant orange groves in Connecticut, but it wouldn't survive and the honey would not be that kind of tropical sunshine flavor. And I do have an orange blossom honey here. So there's certain areas that there's primarily one flower blooming, or it's staggered in a way because different flowers bloom at different times of the year. So you have flowers that bloom in the spring, summer, and fall, and some of them overlap. So in Connecticut, basically, we have what we would call wildflower honey. We have all different kinds of flowers. We don't have meadows. You have buckwheat, but where's that?
Actually, it's in Lebanon, and he was a beekeeper in Lebanon, and what we have in our neck of the woods is alfalfa and sunflowers.
Oh,
So-
wow. I want some of that.
Yeah.
So, you would really need to have where the bees go 4 miles, so you really need to have primarily that one. Do they have like a lot of buckwheat? Is it acres and
It's
acres?
been a couple of years, so I don't know, but we certainly have a
Yeah,
lot
it
of
might-
honey.
It might not be a pure
Right.
buckwheat, but it might have some characteristics of what we know as a buckwheat honey. So really in Connecticut, we have wildflower, we have all mixed different honeys. I might taste it and say, oh, I taste a little bit of linden, or I taste a little bit of clover, dandelion, it just depends. But you really need to have an area that's got a lot of that one flower. If you want what we call like a single origin honey, like from primarily one flower. But there's always a little something mixed in it,
Right.
but it can be primarily one flower in certain regions. So yeah, that's a good question. They're all good questions.
So on the longevity of how long you can keep, kangaroos who have a bottle, can use to lose it, and also, I've heard an anecdote that they found honey in the ancient tombs of Egypt, and that they said, at the time I heard that they said you can still eat it today because this leaves not imposed, is that true?
Yeah, so honey is a fresh raw food. It's like you can harvest it, you can take it out of the hive and you can eat it. It doesn't need any processing. It's like take an apple from the tree and you eat it. You don't have to cook it, so you don't have to do anything to honey. It's just right out of hive, like that day that I went. So it doesn't need any processing, and that was like the first thing that I thought when I was visiting the beekeepers, like I was like, do I have to pasteurize this or something? No, it's raw. It's a product of nature from the flower. So with that said, honey does not get better with age. It's not like wine in that way. So after you harvest it, it slowly starts deteriorating because the smells and the flavors of honey come from volatile and non-volatile compounds that are like essential oils that dissipate over time. And then as honey ages, the color gets darker. Now, the regular consumer, you guys are not really gonna notice that the way I would. I would be like, oh, this honey's too dark to be linden honey. You know, I would know that. So most people wouldn't know that. And for me personally, it's a fresh raw product. I think that honey should be consumed within like the first 2 years, 3 years at the most. But who has a honey jar that long? Like after you taste these honeys, you would not, none of these honeys, you eat. People tell me they eat the honey jar like in a week. They're like, oh my God, I have to hide it from my family. So honey doesn't really get better with age. And for me personally, after 3 years, I don't want to eat it because there's plenty of good fresh honey that I would rather taste, you know, all that really good flavor. And yes, the honey was found in King's Tut's tomb. That was like one of my deep dives that I had to find out. So I went online and I found this obscure website that had all the sketches that Howard Carter had done of every artifact that he found in King Tut tomb. Well, cut to one of them, he had this clay vessel and it had this hieratic script, which is pre-hieroglyphics, and it had the symbol of a bee on it. And at first they didn't know what it was, but then later it was translated by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and they found out it was honey. So honey was found in the tombs of the pharaohs and with all the other important things they would need for the afterlife, like olive oil, wine, and everything else. And yes, you can eat it, but it doesn't taste good.
Right.
You know, you can eat anything, but it's not always good for you and it doesn't taste good. But yeah, it was probably edible and it's not gonna taste like fresh honey, you know, but yeah, it's probably, I don't know who got to taste it because I would like to be the one, but I don't know. So one back there first, and then we'll come back.
This is also used in mummification process and bandages.
Yes, exactly. So the ancient Egyptians were some of the first beekeepers and they were very, very sophisticated. They would put their bees on the Nile on boats and they would follow the bloom. So when the flowers were blooming, they would make sure that the bees would be right there to catch the bloom. The also thing is that they used to use propolis, honey, and beeswax to mummify, and that's why the mummies were survived so many years because of propolis. And they used to paint on the walls, you know, scenes of beekeeping and honey harvest, and they used beeswax, which is called encaustic painting, if anybody knows. They would paint with melted beeswax and pigments, and even Pompeii, a lot of the art on the walls in Pompeii were painted with beeswax before they had tubes of paint. What did they use? They used nature. They used plants to make color and beeswax as a binder. I mean, some people used egg tempera as a binder, but bees do it all. I mean, like there's nothing bees do not do. It's pretty amazing.
We have time for one more question.
You had a question, right? Was there anybody else?
So you were saying that honey is a raw product and you can just eat it. Like when you go to like the farmer's market or the stores, like some will say raw honey and some will say, I guess just regular honey. Like,
Yeah.
so is that just like an advertising thing or?
Yeah. So the truth is that anybody can say their honey is raw because it's not regulated. You can say it's local, you can say it's natural, you can say it's healing. All of those words are just marketing terms. So, you know, honey by nature is raw. Like I said, you take it out of the hive, you eat it, it's like an apple, it's raw, it's not cooked. But there's no regulation, so people can say their honey is raw, they can say, you know, all of these things, and it's not really regulated. So I don't know how you navigate that world except to talk to the beekeeper, go directly to the farmer's market, go to the farm stand and really kind of get that information and talk to them because beekeepers love to talk about their bees and honey. And you know, they will give you all, they'll spill the beans, they'll tell you everything. So that's the best way. And yeah, I mean, it's the Wild West out there, you know, when it comes to buying honey. You know, whenever I go to Whole Foods, I always see people standing in front of the honey aisle and like, how do you pick it? So I try to help them. Don't get that one, this one's better. But yeah, it's really tough out there for the consumer. And this is one of the things that beekeepers complain the most about is that they do the work, they make this great product, they're taking care of bees, it's really hard labor. Very physical, very time consuming to do it right, not just be a beehive or be a beekeeper. And, then they have this like $3 honey bear in the store that people buy, or they go to the big box stores and they get this big thing for like, $10, and it's not even really honey. And beekeepers have the real liquid gold, and it's $15, $20, and it's worth every penny of it. So, yeah, it's tough. It's tough out there. So yeah, know your source, and that's the best advice, really. And read the book, that you'll learn more about it. And I see they have my first book, Honeybee Lessons from an Accidental Beekeeper. So that's my personal story about how I went to my neighbors and how I fell into the rabbit hole of bees and everything that I had to learn. The first 2 years of beekeeping. So if you're interested in bees and you want like a personal story from a regular person who just, got involved with bees, that's the book for you.
So you live in Connecticut, and you speak in Connecticut?
Yeah, I'm in Weston,
In Weston?
yeah, near Westport.
Okay. And you sell at markets or?
Used to sell at farmers markets a long time ago. I don't do that anymore. I do less and less selling of honey as much now. I'm a teacher for the National Register and I'm an author. So I'm kind of migrating into more education. So my goal is to get beekeepers and people educated and I really want to elevate honey to the point where like the culinary community and chefs are really using beekeepers' honey, and like all of these food and wine festivals that have wine tastings and olive oil tastings have a honey tasting. Like, how can we get that to happen? Does anybody have any connections? I've had
Great
these
idea.
conversations with these food and wine festivals. They're all
Right.
over the place, to get a honey tasting. So that's my goal, is to really, you have a connection?
New Britain is hosting a honey festival in April, which I am planning.
Oh, is that it? Wait, that's in, where is it?
It's in New Britain.
Yeah, I talked to somebody, you were gonna have it in October.
Yeah, I'm going to change the date, make it a little later to more sense of planning and.
Yeah, okay, well, let's talk. But, yeah, the culinary world has not really fully embraced honey the way they should. So really to elevate it, I'm teaching a lot, I'm not doing as much honey sales. So I'm doing a lot more talks and writing and teaching.
Do you still have your hives?
Yeah, I do. I do. I'm gonna go to Dubai in January to teach women beekeepers about honey tasting. They
In
wanna-
Dubai?
Yeah, they want
Wow.
to do.
What grows there?
What grows there?
Yeah.
Oh, well,
look it up.
there's a spread in there in the book. They have cedar honey, and they have all these other sacred honeys because it's very sacred in the Muslim religion. They have very different, very unusual honeys, different plants that we don't have here. Yeah,
Cool.
I
Very
think we're gonna move to the tasting
yeah,
now.
we have to make time for tasting. So we have some honeys and some cheeses that you can taste. I can tell you what the honeys are. And we didn't put little notes on there. But yeah, so everybody, you're welcome to do that. And then I'm gonna sign some books, I guess.
So we have copies of both titles at this register. We also have additional copies for sale at the register in the front. And we'll have time to do signing and honey tasting, and we also are serving Prosecco.
Yes.
Hey.